Good evening, and welcome to an in-depth exploration of one of Russia's most chilling criminal cases. The subject of our examination is Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov, born in 1964, who earned the grim moniker, the Werewolf, or the Angarsk Maniac, over a span of nearly 2 decades. From 1992 until 2010, Popkov carried out a series of brutal murders targeting women. He was eventually convicted of killing 78 victims, though the total number is a matter of ongoing speculation. Popkov's crimes took place largely in the Siberian city of Angarsk and its surrounding regions, casting a dark shadow over the community. His ability to evade detection for so many years reflects a disturbing confluence of factors, including the complexities of post-Soviet Russia, the vulnerabilities of his victims, and the failings of investigative procedures at the time. With each crime, Popkov refined his methods, remaining a step ahead of law enforcement until a crucial combination of forensic advances and dogged detective work finally led to his downfall. In the following sections, we will delve into the life stories of those who fell victim to Popkov, recount the extensive police investigation, dissect the psychological dimensions of his actions, and conclude with reflections on the societal ramifications of one of the most notorious serial killers in modern Russian history. Part 2 The Victims' Journeys. The social and historical context of Angarsk. To grasp the scope and horror of Mikhail Popkov's crimes, it is essential to first understand the environment in which he operated. Angarsk, located in the Irkutsk Oblast of Siberia, is a city born in the Soviet industrial era. Found in the 1940s near the Angar River, it grew rapidly due to its oil refineries and petrochemical plants. By the 1990s, the start of Popkov's killing spree, Angarsk was a city in transition. The collapse of the Soviet Union ushered in economic instability, rising unemployment, and a general sense of uncertainty. Many residents struggled to adapt to the new capitalist realities, while infrastructure for public services, including policing, faced unprecedented challenges. Violent crime surged in various regions of Russia during this era, as organized crime groups, opportunistic criminals, and serial predators found new gaps to exploit. Angarsk itself was not a particularly large city compared to Moscow or St. Petersburg, but its industrial sprawl and proximity to vast, sparsely populated areas made it an environment where certain types of crime could flourish undetected. Roads leading out of town passed through isolated territories, dense forests, and remote settlements, offering potential hiding places for a determined criminal. In some ways, this backdrop parallels what was seen in other post-Soviet locales. Citizens became more reticent to report incidents, partly due to waning trust in law enforcement and the judicial system. Corruption and insufficient resources hampered effective policing. It was within this societal landscape that Popkov began to perpetrate a series of murders so staggering in scope that he would eventually become one of the most prolific known serial killers in Russian history. Mikhail Popkov's background and early warning signs. Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov was born in 1964. Public records and later interviews revealed that he led a seemingly ordinary life for many years. He served as a police officer in Angarsk and later worked in security-related roles. This position of authority and familiarity with law enforcement procedures offered him unique insights into investigative methods, knowledge he would eventually use to his advantage. Friends and acquaintances sometimes described him as calm or strict in demeanor. However, certain hints pointed to underlying aggression. Popkov reportedly harbored strong beliefs about women and morality, nothing which might have contributed to a violent streak if he perceived someone as crossing his personal boundaries or transgressing what he considered appropriate behavior. His colleagues in the police force did not always suspect him. His ability to compartmentalize, acting as a dutiful officer on one hand and a vicious predator on the other, reflected a dangerous duality. During his earliest murders in the early 1990s, very few direct signs linked him to the crimes. Women in various neighborhoods of Angarsk began to disappear, and bodies were found bearing the marks of extreme violence. Yet no pattern immediately pointed toward a fellow policeman as the culprit. At the time, the idea that the killer could be one of their own seemed unthinkable to many. Identifying the victims, patterns in age, lifestyle, and vulnerability, Popkov's reign of terror spanned nearly 2 decades, and over that period, he targeted dozens of women from various backgrounds. Yet a closer look reveals certain trends. Many victims were found to be in their 20s to early 40s, though there were cases involving younger or somewhat older women. He seemed to favor those who were out alone at night, sometimes near bars, clubs, or social events. Additionally, some victims may have been engaging in behaviors he deemed immoral or disrespectful in his twisted moral code. It is crucial to remember that even when patterns emerge, each victim was a unique individual with her own ambitions, fears, and loved ones. The seemingly systematic way Popkov selected, attacked, and disposed of these women can give the false impression that they were interchangeable. In reality, each had a personal story that ended in a brutal encounter with an individual bent on inflicting lethal violence. The isolation or perceived at-risk behaviors of some victims made them easier targets. For instance, a woman leaving a late night gathering, possibly under the influence of alcohol, or walking home alone might catch Popkov's attention. His method often involved offering a ride or presenting himself in a position of trust, on occasion leveraging his status as a police officer to persuade the victim to enter his vehicle. Nothing. Some victims were found partially undressed, suggesting a sexual or sadistic component to the crimes, though Popkov's motivations were complex, possibly mixing moralistic rage with an urge for domination. Early victims' initial shockwaves in the community. The earliest confirmed murders attributed to Popkov date to the early 1990s. The bodies of several women were discovered in wooded areas outside Angarsk, near roads with low traffic. These crime scenes carried telltale signs of intense violence, including multiple stab wounds, blunt force trauma, or evidence of strangulation. Law enforcement was alarmed but struggled to link the cases, as each victim had slightly different injuries. Nothing. While the brutality signaled a potential serial killer, the concept of a single individual preying on women in this industrial city had not yet taken hold. Families of the victims clamored for answers. One mother recounted how her daughter had been planning to meet friends at a local cafe one evening, only to vanish on the way home. Another victim was found days after last being seen stepping out for a brief walk, leaving her coat behind in a friend's car. Nothing. Each family's anguish played out in a climate of growing distrust toward both local authorities and society's ability to protect women, especially at night. Nothing. Some local rumors attributed the killings to roving criminals or possible gang activity, theories that local police initially did not rule out. Yet the repeated discovery of bodies in similar conditions pointed towards something more personal. Investigators tried to reference known offenders, persons with histories of violence, or suspicious behavioral patterns, but for some time, no single suspect emerged. Escalation and evolving methods. As the years passed, the body count rose. Popkov's homicidal activities appeared to intensify in certain periods, then subside temporarily, creating a cyclical pattern that made it difficult to track. Investigators studying the case years later would note that these pauses might coincide with changes in Popkov's personal life, such as family events, job shifts, or times when he might have relocated. His methods also displayed evolution. In some murders, he used sharp instruments, knives, screwdrivers, or other piercing objects. In others, he resorted to blunt force trauma, There were instances where signs of sexual assault were found, while in other cases, the sexual element was less clear. This variability confounded efforts to pinpoint a single offender, since some serial killers adhere to more uniform rituals. Popkov's willingness to change tactics revealed a disconcerting adaptability. Word of these killings spread beyond Angarsk into neighboring communities in the Irkutsk region. Women traveling alone at night grew more cautious. Urban legends circulate about a maniac with an axe, or an soldier-turned-murderer, though few people imagined the killer might actually be a quietly married police officer. The paradox of his double life would remain hidden for a long time, allowing him to refine and continue his lethal spree. The illusion of safety. Trusting a uniform. One of the most harrowing aspects of Popkov's predation was his exploitation of trust, a resource that many in the community placed in the local police. By some accounts, Popkov would offer rides to women who needed to travel late at night, possibly framing it as a courtesy or a protective measure. If the victim recognized him as a policeman, she might feel a certain level of comfort, unaware that the real threat was coming from the very person who should have protected her. This exploitation of trust speaks to a deeper social betrayal. Law enforcement, ideally, is entrusted with ensuring public safety. A policeman who uses his badge or uniform as a lure represents a profound breach of that duty. Victims lured under these pretenses might not have realized the danger until it was too late. In some instances, partial or contradictory recollections from surviving witnesses see or near victims did hint at someone in an official capacity, but these clues were dismissed or not fully pursued early on. Distrust of the police was strong enough that many survivors of near attacks might have hesitated to come forward if they suspected involvement from within the force. Survivors, accounts, and narrow escapes. Although Popkov was highly lethal, there appear to have been a few potential survivors or near-miss incidents. Some women recounted experiences of being approached by a man in a car, offering a ride at night, only for them to decline due to an unexplainable sense of unease. Others reported odd or frightening encounters with a uniformed man acting in ways that seemed incongruous with standard police procedures. Such stories underscore how close some individuals came to becoming victims. In one recollection, a woman described how she accepted a ride from a policeman who seemed friendly enough at first. However, when the conversation grew unsettling, she insisted on getting out of the car. She later learned that other women in that same time frame had been found murdered under similar circumstances. While she could not positively identify Popkov from any official lineup, the parallels fueled suspicions that the Angarsk maniac might indeed have been operating from within law enforcement. Family lives interrupted, the impact on victims, loved ones. Each of Popkov's confirmed victims had parents, siblings, children, friends, or colleagues whose lives were profoundly altered. Many families undertook frantic searches and pleas to authorities. Some even posted homemade flyers or appealed to local press, hoping to gather information from anyone who might have last seen the missing woman. Anguish turned to devastation when bodies were discovered in advanced states of decomposition, making identification emotionally harrowing. In some cases, families had to wait months or years for definitive answers. Local morgues and forensic labs, strained by limited resources, struggled with timely identification, especially in older cases. The psychological toll on families cannot be overstated. Feelings of guilt, anger, and helplessness often consumed those left behind. As the pattern of female homicides became more evident, fear spread throughout entire neighborhoods, altering social behaviors such as traveling in groups or avoiding certain areas after sundown. Societal reactions and gender dynamics. Popkov's targeting of women also ignited debates about gender, based violence and social attitudes in Russia. Though some officials attempted to frame the murders as random acts of brutality, others saw a clear misogynistic current in his actions. Popkov's later confessions and statements indicated that he rationalized his killings based on a twisted notion of punishing immoral behavior or promiscuity. This moralistic stance, however warped, echoes broader social tensions wherein female autonomy and behavior can be harshly judged. For women in Angarsk and adjacent regions, these murders highlighted the vulnerability they faced in everyday life. The fact that a uniformed authority figure could be the perpetrator further eroded their sense of safety. Grassroots initiatives emerged, some urging women to practice self-defense or to keep each other informed about suspicious activities. As the crimes persisted, certain local press outlets called for better accountability in law enforcement, suspecting that the slow progress might be linked to corruption or willful ignorance. Specific stories. Nothing. A closer look at individual victims. To bring clarity to the scale of Popkov's atrocities, it helps to examine a few individual stories. While not all of these cases were confirmed immediately, they eventually contributed to the overall tapestry of violence associated with him. Anna S., sub-pseudonym, a young mother in her late 20s, Anna worked at a small grocery shop near the industrial zone. She often closed the shop late. One winter night, she accepted a ride from a man who identified himself as a police officer concerned about her traveling alone. Her mutilated body was discovered weeks later on the outskirts of Angarsk, partially hidden beneath snow. Forensics suggested multiple stab wounds and a possible sexual assault. Anna left behind a 5-year-old daughter, Marina K., pseudonym. Known among friends for her outgoing personality, Marina had celebrated a birthday at a local bar. Intoxicated, she left on foot, determined to walk the short distance home. She never arrived. Authorities later found her body in a remote area. The severity of the injuries indicated extreme rage. Her family described her as cheerful and kind-hearted, leading investigators to suspect that the murderer might have been motivated by personal biases or a perverse desire for domination. Tatiana L., a pseudonym, unlike some other victims. Tatiana survived a confrontation with Popkov, albeit with life-altering injuries. She recalled being offered a ride by a uniformed man, only to be attacked when she questioned his route. The attacker stabbed her multiple times, leaving her for dead, but she managed to crawl to a roadside where a truck driver found her. Her testimony would later become pivotal in linking the murders to a policeman, though it would take years before that information was acted upon decisively. These stories are a fraction of the total, each reflecting the terror that Popkov inflicted. Some accounts overlap or differ in detail, reflecting the varying conditions under which murders took place. What unites them is the stark finality of an encounter with a man whose violent impulses knew few limits. The role of alcohol and late night environments. Many of Popkov's killings occurred late at night, often involving victims who had been drinking or were otherwise seeking to return home from a social venue. While this should never be construed as victim blaming, the circumstances made them more vulnerable to his manipulations. The presence of alcohol might have dulled a victim's capacity for cautious judgment, and the relative emptiness of the streets at those hours provided fewer potential witnesses. Popkov appeared to tailor his approach to these conditions. If he spotted someone inebriated, the ruse of offering help could be especially effective. Conversely, if the individual was sober but still alone, his status as an officer might put the victim at ease. This predatory adaptability underscores how meticulously he planned and executed his murders, a hidden pattern geographical and seasonal factors over time. Investigators noticed that many bodies were found near certain roads or wooded paths on the outskirts of Angarsk, as well as in neighboring districts. Seasonal factors sometimes influence the timing of discoveries. In winter, snow cover delayed the detection of remains, while in summer, hikers or passersby might more quickly come across a victim. Popkov may have capitalized on these shifts, disposing of bodies in places where they would likely remain concealed for longer stretches, thus complicating forensic analysis. The scale of this pattern gradually emerged as bodies accumulated. Some speculated that multiple killers could be at work, a theory that gained traction because of the varied manner of death. Yet each new case added a dreadful consistency to the overarching narrative. Someone was repeatedly targeting women, disposing of them in remote locations, and evading capture with disturbing ease. Growing anxiety and local folklore, the rumors swirling around Angarsk during the height of Popkov's killing spree reflected the community's deep anxiety. Tales of a werewolf-like figure patrolling the streets at night gained a life of their own. While such myths were hyperbolic, they did reflect an underlying truth, a sense of the killer's almost superhuman ability to remain invisible and strike at will. Urban legends also sprang up claiming that the murderer had supernatural attributes or that he carried out occult rituals. These stories, while unsubstantiated, reveal the collective psyche of a community grappling with unexplained terror. In an environment where local authorities struggled to provide clear explanations or solutions, many residents sought answers in folklore, other possible offenders, confusion and copycat murders. The lengthy time frame of Popkov's crimes raises the possibility that some murders attributed to him might have been perpetrated by other individuals. Conversely, some unsolved cases in the region might have been committed by Popkov but never confirmed. Investigators eventually had to consider the phenomenon of potential copycat killers, people who might mimic the methods receiving media coverage. For families mourning loved ones, this uncertainty fueled a desperate search for clarity. They wanted absolute confirmation that the woman their life fell victim to a particular killer, rather than remaining in a gray area of speculation. As the body count soared, the lines blurred between confirmed Popkov murders and other incidents of violence. Official figures would later place his proven victim count at 78, although Popkov himself hinted that the number could be higher. These ambiguities underscored the challenges of conclusively connecting every single murder to one individual in a sprawling, under-resourced region. Intersections with organized crime. In the early post-Soviet years, organized crime groups held influence over various economic and territorial assets in Siberia, including the Angarsk region. Murders and disappearances sometimes got entangled with mob disputes. This murky atmosphere provided Popkov with additional cover, as authorities initially suspected gang involvement in some of the female homicides. Organized crime violence in the region typically followed different patterns, targeting business rivals or those who owed debts. Yet the general climate of fear could muddy the investigative waters. Though there is scant evidence that Popkov directly cooperated with any criminal group, the broader environment of lawlessness indirectly aided him. Preoccupied with handling mafia-related crimes, local police might have initially diverted fewer resources to a pattern of what seemed like separate, unlinked murders of women. By the time serious attention was directed toward a possible serial killer, numerous lives had already been lost. The unrecognized faces. Identifying Jane does, one of the saddest realities of Popkov's long campaign of terror is that not all victims have been definitively identified. Some bodies were too decomposed by the time they were discovered, while others lacked any form of ID or matching missing person reports. Transient populations, sometimes from other areas, might have been traveling through Angarsk, making them particularly hard to track. Each unidentified body remains a silent testament to the scale of Popkov's crimes. Investigators, forensic specialists, and volunteers worked to match these remains with potential missing person cases. Over the years, DNA testing improved, assisting in the process. However, resource limits often meant that not every set of unidentified remains underwent advanced testing. Even in cases that were tested, conclusive family matches were not guaranteed. Long-term community impact. The cumulative effect of Popkov's actions extended far beyond his immediate victims and their families. Neighborhoods reorganized themselves, with groups of women collectively ensuring no one walked alone late at night. Social gatherings ended earlier, or participants arranged for safe transportation. Young people, especially young women, were warned repeatedly by parents to exercise extreme caution. Local businesses such as bars, clubs, and late-night establishments felt the shift as patronage sometimes declined. News of unsolved murders discouraged visitors from other regions. In the longer term, the city's reputation became entwined with the specter of a violent predator, a stigma that would take significant time and effort to overcome. The killer's personal ephemerage, fatherhood, and contradictions. Among the most perplexing facets of Mikhail Popkov's story is the apparent normalcy of his domestic situation. He was married and had a daughter, his wife, herself an employee of law enforcement at one point, and their child lived seemingly ordinary lives, unaware, or in denial, of the depths of Popkov's activities outside the home. In interviews after his arrest, Popkov insisted that his family life had been harmonious, though the validity of such claims is debatable. Forensic psychologists later remarked on the disconcerting ability of certain serial killers to maintain stable relationships while committing heinous acts in secret. Popkov's knowledge of investigative procedures, gleaned from his time as an officer, allowed him to conceal evidence effectively, ensuring that even those closest to him remained ignorant of his true nature. That he could return from a night of murder to a household routine underscores the compartmentalization at the heart of psychopathy, or severe antisocial personality disorders, inconsistencies and partial truths in Popkov's statements. After his eventual capture, Popkov gave multiple interviews and confessions. At times, he framed his actions as a moral crusade, targeting women who he believed engaged in behavior he disapproved of. In other moments, he offered contradictory accounts, hinting that the thrill of killing or sexual violence was his primary driver. Nothing. Some statements may have been attempts to rationalize his violence, while others were designed to taunt investigators or shape public perception. This inconsistency adds another layer of complexity to understanding his motives. Serial killers often struggle to provide coherent explanations for their crimes, as their actions stem from deeply disturbed impulses. Popkov's admission that he cleansed the city of immoral women reveals a twisted self-justification. Yet it does not fully encompass the breadth of his brutality, which extended to many women who did not fit any supposed moral wrongdoing. Charting the full scale, over 70 confirmed deaths. Ultimately, Mikhail Popkov was convicted of killing 78 women, making him one of the deadliest serial killers known in modern Russia and indeed globally. Yet questions remain about whether the true count is higher. Some speculate that Popkov used his confessions selectively, admitting certain murders to appear cooperative while withholding details of others for reasons of ego, fear of further punishment, or the mere enjoyment of controlling the narrative. For each victim, official recognition came through a combination of evidence: DNA matching, crime scene analysis, or Popkov's own testimony. Even so, a portion of Russia's cold cases involving murdered or missing women from the 1990s and 2000s remain unsolved. The possibility that Popkov's hand extended into some of these cases cannot be dismissed, though conclusive links may never be established. Transitional years and the 2010 turning point. By 2010, Popkov's reign of terror was nearing its end, though he had managed to operate largely undetected for nearly 2 decades. Advances in DNA technology, the growing unification of missing person databases, and the dogged persistence of select investigators paved the way for a major break in the case. The year 2010 stands out because it signaled the beginning of an intensive effort to reevaluate old evidence, partially funded by newer federal initiatives to modernize Russian law enforcement. Nothing. At the same time, Popkov's personal circumstances had shifted. He had left the police force, worked in private security, and was grappling with health issues. Some of his last murders took place around this period, but the net was closing in. In the next section, we will explore the intricate process by which investigators finally tied Popkov's past to the spate of female homicides, leading to his arrest and eventual conviction. Part 3. The investigation and capture, early investigative hurdles. From the mid-1990s onward, local law enforcement knew they faced a troubling pattern of murdered women in Angarsk. Yet, several significant obstacles prevented them from connecting the dots. First, Soviet-era record-keeping had not fully modernized, so crucial data often remained locked in paper files scattered across different departments. Second, budget constraints limited the range of forensic testing that could be undertaken, particularly DNA analysis, which was in its infancy in Russia at that time. While a handful of investigators suspected a single killer might be at work, they lacked definitive proof. Some believed multiple criminals were involved, pointing to variations in how victims were killed. Efforts to form a specialized task force were repeatedly stalled by bureaucratic issues, staff shortages, and competing priorities. Organized crime, drug trafficking, and other serious offenses likewise demanded attention. Sporadic task forces and informal collaboration. Despite official disorganization, certain dedicated officers formed informal networks to share details of unsolved homicides. They cross-referenced victim profiles, crime scene notes, and forensic data, aiming to identify common threads. Over time, these detectives noticed that many victims were last seen late at night, sometimes near bars, and that several had mention of riding in a vehicle shortly before their disappearance. No single name arose, but the uniformity of these circumstantial details pushed them closer to suspecting that one predator was behind numerous killings. Interdepartmental collaboration grew more robust in the early 2000s. Detectives from Angarsk and Irkutsk began pooling data, occasionally consulting with specialists in Moscow. Through these channels, they learned about emerging forensic techniques and the importance of thorough DNA collection from crime scenes. Even so, slow turnarounds from overstretched labs made it difficult to act swiftly on new leads. Forensic progress and the promise of DNA, one major breakthrough for law enforcement worldwide during this period, was the increased reliability and decreasing cost of DNA profiling. While Russia lagged behind some Western nations in implementing large-scale DNA databases, certain cases with high priority gained access to advanced labs. By the late 2000s, enough momentum had built that selected unsolved murders from the Angarsk area underwent new DNA analysis, comparing trace evidence to potential suspects. Investigators began collecting DNA samples from a wide range of individuals who might be connected to the murders, including known violent offenders, ex-convicts, and eventually some law enforcement personnel. Popkov, having served in the police force, was among those approached. He volunteered a DNA sample, presumably believing that his cunning and knowledge of evidence handling would protect him. This moment would prove pivotal. The growing web of suspicion concurrently. A renewed push for police accountability gained traction in Russia, partly due to public frustration over unsolved crimes and corruption scandals. internal affairs divisions started auditing local police stations to ensure that officers did not have undisclosed criminal records or suspicious behavior patterns. While these measures were not specifically aimed at uncovering a serial killer, they inadvertently shone a light on potential misconduct within the force. Popkov, like any officer, had a personnel file. Nothing. Colleagues thought of him as disciplined, though some recalled peculiar remarks he made about women's moral character. He had left the force in the late 1990s, reportedly due to illness. But some gossip suggested other reasons, such as rumored improprieties or a conflict with superiors. Investigators who later scrutinized his file found nothing overtly incriminating, but they noted that the timeline of his service overlapped suspiciously with a spike in local murders. The DNA match that changed everything. The turning point came when a partial DNA profile from one of the victims' bodies matched the sample Popkov had provided. While the initial match was incomplete, it was strong enough to elevate Popkov from a routine sample provider to a key person of interest. Additional forensic work confirmed the match in multiple cases. Nothing. Investigators realized with shock that the killer they had been pursuing for nearly 2 decades might be one of their own. An ex-police officer who had used his knowledge and position to facilitate a spree of unprecedented violence. Such a revelation unleashed a mix of determination and embarrassment within law enforcement. Determination to bring the case to a close, embarrassment at how the predator had walked among them for so long, sometimes literally wearing the same uniform. Investigators moved quickly to gather corroborating evidence, retrieving any items Popkov might have stored, re-examining older crime scene samples that might tie back to him, and reviewing statements from near-miss survivors who described a policeman or official-like figure. Surveillance and preparations for arrest before confronting Popkov directly. The task force set up discreet surveillance. They tracked his daily routines, checked phone records, and quietly interviewed people who knew him. This phase aimed to confirm that he was not currently planning or committing new murders. Investigators wanted an airtight case, aware that a seasoned former officer might attempt to destroy evidence or build an alibi if he sensed scrutiny. During this period, Popkov's behavior appeared outwardly normal. He lived a relatively low-key life, sometimes traveling. The inactivity might have been due to his age, health issues, or a sense that the net was closing in. Whatever the reason, the lull in new murders was a relief to investigators, giving them time to solidify their case. The arrest, the precise details of Popkov's arrest, vary across media reports. Nothing, but it generally took place without dramatic resistance. Police approached him when he was leaving his home or workplace, detaining him on suspicion of multiple homicides tied to the DNA evidence. Having once been part of the law enforcement community, Popkov understood the gravity of the accusations. He reportedly appeared calm, though he offered immediate denials of involvement. The subsequent search of his residence yielded items that raised further suspicion, including personal notebooks, clothing that might have contained trace evidence, and possibly tools or weapons. Investigators handled these materials carefully to avoid contaminating them, aware that such items could corroborate connections to some of the unsolved murders. Interrogations. Shifting stories and confessions. Under interrogation, Popkov vacillated between denial, partial admission, and eventually more detailed confessions. He seemed to enjoy the psychological interplay, occasionally hinting at knowledge of additional murders. At times, he framed his actions as moralistic, claiming that he targeted women who were unfaithful or loose, statements that outraged investigators and the public alike. Other times, he claimed memory lapses, nothing, as though the brutality of his acts was hazy in his mind. Over months of questioning, detectives extracted enough consistent details to link him concretely to a series of killings. He led authorities to locations where he had disposed of bodies or items belonging to victims. These revelations further confirmed his guilt. Yet even then, he withheld information about certain cases, possibly relishing the power he held through selective disclosure. Building the prosecution's case, prosecutors took considerable time preparing a case that would likely be one of the largest serial murder trials in Russian history. They cataloged evidence for each victim, cross-referencing Popkov's confessions with forensic confirmations. Some cases had been cold for over a decade. Families were notified that their loved one's murders had finally been solved. And while many were relieved, the emotional toll of reliving the trauma in court would be significant. Authorities faced the daunting task of deciding which murders to formally charge. Popkov alluded to dozens of killings, some of which lacked conclusive physical evidence. In the end, nothing. The confirmed count for which he was convicted reached 78, but investigators suspect that the total could be higher. The prosecution's strategy was to focus on the murders with the strongest forensic link, thereby ensuring a definitive conviction and maximum sentencing. The media and public pressure, news of Popkov's arrest spread across Russia, eventually reaching international audiences. The narrative of a policeman turned serial killer was too sensational to ignore. Media outlets analyzed every aspect of the case, from Popkov's police background to the repeated investigative failures over the years. Interviews with victims' families highlighted how they felt overlooked or dismissed when they initially sought justice. In the court of public opinion, many demand a thorough review of law enforcement protocols to ensure that such a tragedy could never recur. A handful of sensationalist tabloids even portrayed Popkov as a vigilant, twisting his statements about punishing immoral behavior into a distorted folk narrative. More reputable journals and TV programs, however, focused on the systemic breakdowns, misogynistic undertones of the crimes, and the urgent need to reform policing. This media pressure, while occasionally chaotic, helped keep attention on the case, ensuring that it did not quietly fade from public view. The trial proceedings, Popkov's trial, unfolded in stages. Initially, hearings addressed specific victims whose evidence was strongest and most clearly connected to him. Over time, additional charges were added. He was seated in a glass enclosure, a standard practice for high-profile defendants in Russian courts. Journalists and relatives of the victims packed the courtroom, absorbing each grim detail. Popkov showed limited remorse, often appearing stoic or indifferent. His descriptions of the murders were clinical. Occasionally, he smirked or made offhand remarks that seemed to trivialize his acts, a stance that further enraged the families. Psychologists testified about his possible disorders, and forensic experts laid out the physical evidence tying him to each crime scene. One by one, the jury and the judge confronted the overwhelming weight of proof. Conviction and sentencing. Following a protracted legal process, Popkov was found guilty of murdering 78 women. Although he had claimed responsibility for more, Russian law places a moratorium on the death penalty, so the harshest sentence was life imprisonment. The court underscored the exceptional cruelty of his actions, his abuse of authority, and the irreparable harm he inflicted on victims and their families. He was sent to a high-security penal colony in Siberia, where he remains to this day. The trial's conclusion offered a measure of closure to some families, though many expressed ongoing grief and anger. Some wanted more admissions from Popkov, believing that he was still hiding details of additional murders. Others felt relief that the Angarsk maniac would never again walk free, though the scars of his crimes would endure indefinitely. Post-trial reflections and reforms in the aftermath. Local and national law enforcement agencies conducted internal reviews, hoping to identify how an ex-police officer committed so many murders without detection. Some reforms were introduced, including stricter background checks for police recruits, improved forensic record keeping, and attempts to integrate databases that track violent crimes across different regions. Victims' advocacy groups also pressed for broader cultural changes, urging a deeper understanding of gender-based violence and more responsive structures for reporting missing women. Nothing. Despite these efforts, the case of Mikhail Popkov remains a haunting example of investigative blind spots, institutional complacency, and the cunning of a serial killer who exploited his insider knowledge. In the next section, we will delve deeper into the psychological dimensions that may have driven Popkov to commit his heinous acts and allowed him to maintain a semblance of ordinary life while committing extraordinary violence. Part 4: Free psychological analysis of the criminal, childhood, and adolescent influences. Little is publicly documented about Popkov's early childhood, but by piecing together snippets from interviews and psychological reports, certain themes emerge. Born in 1964, he grew up during the Soviet era, where strong patriarchal norms and stoic attitudes toward emotional expression were common. His father's role is rarely mentioned, suggesting possible familial dysfunction or emotional distance. Some sources imply that Popkov struggled with social relationships in his youth, although this is not definitively confirmed. The interplay of authoritarian parenting, rigid moral codes, and limited emotional outlets may have laid the groundwork for his later distortions. However, thousands of individuals in similar environments do not become murderers. Nothing. Highlighting the necessity of specific personal or biological factors that might have predisposed Popkov to violence. Without thorough, long-term psychiatric evaluations from his earlier years, the exact nature of his development remains partly speculative. Military and police experience. Popkov's trajectory included a stint in law enforcement, a role that demands not only discipline, but also an understanding of criminal behavior. His familiarity with police procedures gave him a unique perspective on how to avoid detection. This strategic advantage cannot be overstated. He understood the significance of physical evidence, how to limit forensic traces, and how to provide plausible explanations for his whereabouts. Moreover, some criminologists argue that certain individuals with sadistic or controlling tendencies might be drawn to professions that grant them authority. While many law enforcement officers are dedicated and compassionate, the uniform can also appeal to someone seeking power over others. If Popkov entered the police force with underlying violent fantasies, the environment could have reinforced his sense of control, fueling an emerging criminal persona. Moralistic delusions and misogyny, central to Popkov's self-proclaimed motive, was a warped moral judgment. He claimed to kill women he perceived as immoral or unfaithful, suggesting a deep-rooted misogyny masked as moral righteousness. This justification aligns with a broader pattern among certain offenders who rationalize violence as a form of correction. Popkov's references to purifying the city echo similar rhetoric used by other killers who frame their actions as vigilantism, punishing perceived societal transgressions. Such moralistic delusions can combine with personal insecurities or trauma, resulting in lethal aggression. Popkov might have encountered triggers, perhaps witnessing or suspecting infidelity in his personal life, that amplified his hatred of women. By labeling his victims as morally flawed, he absolved himself of guilt, recasting murder as a twisted sense of duty. Psychopathic or sociopathic traits. The brutality and frequency of Popkov's murders have led many experts to label him as a psychopath or sociopath, though official diagnostic details are not publicly available. Common traits of psychopathy include superficial charm, manipulativeness, lack of empathy, and a predatory lifestyle. Popkov demonstrated an ability to maintain normalcy in his personal life while systematically murdering dozens of women, indicative of remarkable emotional detachment and compartmentalization. He also exhibited manipulative tendencies in how he lured victims, leveraged his policing background, and controlled the narrative during interrogations. His relationships with colleagues and family likely involved deception at multiple levels. Psychopathy does not necessarily preclude forming emotional bonds, but any bonds that do exist are often overshadowed by a self-serving instrumental view of others. Sexual sadism vests other motives. Popkov's killings frequently included signs of overkill, multiple stab wounds, or evidence of physical brutality beyond what was needed to kill. Overkill can suggest sadistic impulses or extreme rage. Some victims appear to have been sexually assaulted, though the presence of sexual elements varied. This inconsistency leaves open the question of whether sexual gratification played a central role, or if it was secondary to the violent expression of hate and control. Serial killers can exhibit multiple motivational layers. One murder might stem from a desire for sexual domination, while another might be fueled more by anger or a perceived moral crusade. In Popkov's case, the repeated pattern of targeting women under the justification of punishing immorality indicates that violence itself became a ritualized outlet for deeper psychological conflicts. The double life, compartmentalization, and deception. Maintaining a double life for so many years required adept compartmentalization. Popkov managed to remain functional as a husband, father, and co-worker, while simultaneously butchering victims on nights when he was off duty or otherwise unaccounted for. Friends and neighbors recall him as polite, if somewhat reserved. He fooled those closest to him into believing he led an unremarkable life. This split existence is not uncommon among serial killers. In interviews after his capture, Popkov offered no coherent explanation for how he reconciled these parts of himself, simply stating that his family life was separate. Such compartmentalization points to a severely fragmented psyche, capable of isolating violent urges in one box, while presenting a facade of normalcy in another. The psychological impact of being a former policeman. As a former policeman, Popkov likely felt intellectually superior to investigators, believing he could outwit them indefinitely. His pride in that ability surfaced in interrogation sessions, where he teased the possibility of undisclosed victims or flaunted knowledge of how he avoided leaving evidence. This cat and mouse dynamic can be intoxicating for certain individuals who thrive on the power of secret knowledge. Being an ex-officer may also have shaped his sense of identity. Having once been on the side of the law, he understood the reverence and authority that society often grants law enforcement. Committing murders while retaining that badge in memory created a sense of irony or perverse thrill, as though he had turned the institution's power structure upside down for his own benefit. Nothing. Late-onset desistance, health and age factors. Although Popkov's crimes spanned a long period, there were intervals when fewer or no killings occurred. One explanation is that physical factors, such as illness or aging, made him less active. Serial killers often slow down or cease as they age, sometimes because the physical demands of violent crime become harder to meet. Alternatively, he might have feared that forensic advances were catching up, prompting temporary caution. The interplay of these factors underscores that Popkov was not an unstoppable force, but a calculating individual who balanced urges with the practicality of self-preservation. Nothing. His final years before arrest show signs of caution, suggesting that he understood the net was closing. Yet his sense of superiority may have emboldened him to continue until modern forensic science finally sealed his fate. Reflections on remorse and responsibility throughout court proceedings. Popkov provided little evidence of genuine remorse. His statements often focused on blaming the victims for their lifestyles or on deflecting attention to the investigations themselves. This lack of accountability is common in individuals with severe antisocial or psychopathic tendencies. Public reaction to his courtroom demeanor was one of outrage, particularly among survivors and victims, relatives who expected some acknowledgement of the pain he caused. Whether Popkov experienced any private regret remains unknown. Some serial killers claim to find religion or remorse later in life, though these admissions are not always credible. In his case, no substantial sign of a moral reckoning has been reported, reinforcing the notion that his worldview and personal code likely remain twisted. Implications for preventing future offenders. Examining Popkov's psychological profile yields insights that might help prevent or detect similar predators. Foremost is the realization that individuals capable of extreme violence can exist within institutions meant to uphold the law. Rigorous screening, ongoing psychological evaluations, and stringent oversight are crucial in law enforcement settings. Additionally, fostering an environment where whistleblowers and concerned citizens can safely report odd behavior by officers might help detect red flags earlier. Popkov's moralistic rationale highlights the danger of extremist mindsets, misogynistic or otherwise, when combined with personal rage or psychopathy. Educating communities to recognize warning signs of coercive or violent tendencies, even in those holding respected positions, is another key step. While no single approach guarantees the prevention of all serial crimes, a multi-pronged strategy that includes better mental health support, community vigilance, and robust investigative practices can reduce the likelihood of unchecked predators. Part 5. Conclusion. Mikhail Popkov's story stands as a grim reminder of how a single individual can bring fear, pain, and tragedy to an entire community over many years. His long career of violence against women in Angarsk, enabled in part by his position as a police officer, underscores the profound trust people place in law enforcement and the devastating consequences when that trust is betrayed. He exploited societal weaknesses, including the chaotic post-Soviet transition and limited forensic capabilities, to kill with impunity, targeting those he deemed morally flawed. The cumulative toll of his actions remains staggering. 78 confirmed victims, each a person whose life was cruelly cut short. Many left behind grieving families who spent years searching for answers, only to discover that the killer had walked among them in plain sight. His arrest and eventual conviction were the result of painstaking work by dedicated investigators who refused to abandon cold cases and who harnessed the growing power of DNA analysis. Yet his eventual apprehension also highlighted systemic issues within law enforcement that allowed him to remain undetected for so long. From a psychological perspective, Popkov embodied traits of extreme antisocial behavior, showing little to no remorse and using a twisted moral code to justify his acts. His ability to maintain a veneer of normalcy, raising a family, interacting with neighbors, reveals the unnerving capacity of some offenders to lead double lives. Understanding the mental processes behind such compartmentalization provides important lessons for both clinical psychology and criminal profiling, emphasizing the need to integrate more thorough screening and oversight in environments where authority can be easily abused. The lasting legacy of this case goes beyond its horrifying details. It serves as a cautionary tale for communities to remain vigilant and for institutions to adopt more transparent, accountable practices. Measures such as improved forensic resources, comprehensive background checks, and better coordination among agencies can help detect patterns of violence earlier. Cultural dialogues on gender-based violence, moral judgments, and the complex factors that fuel serial killers must continue. Thank you for joining me in this extensive analysis of Mikhail Popkov's case. If you found this discussion informative, you may consider liking this presentation and subscribing. Your support encourages further deep dives into significant true crime cases and their broader implications for society. By examining the darkest corners of human behavior, we aim to shed light on the preventative measures and social reforms that can make our communities safer.